Right. Good afternoon, everybody. I can't believe that it's 3 years since I've actually been here, giving you this little studio talk about what I heard this morning and last night particularly. Last night was a particularly enjoyable inaugural concert. There's always great excitement here when this concert begins. And I was very interested to hear the pianist playing Prokofiev's second piano concerto. The Prokofiev is regarded as perhaps the most difficult piano concerto written. Many pianists say it's extremely difficult, which it is. It has mind-boggling cadenzas in it. Nikita Mindoyantz was the soloist, and he had played, I heard him in 2017 in Duzhniki Stroy, where he played the 8th sonata of Prokofiev. That's one of the war sonatas, and that was extremely impressive. I thought it was perhaps the best Prokofiev I had ever heard, in fact, at that time. But the concert was not only about music. The great film director, Krzysztof Zanussi, was the master of ceremonies, and you couldn't have asked for a more charming presentation of a more civilized time, perhaps we could say. He was gently humorous and told some wonderful stories during the introduction of pieces, particularly about Lutosławski, because his concerto for orchestra was performed after the interval. And he told a story. He made a film about Lutosławski, and he was talking to Lutosławski about when Lutosławski met Churchill, and they asked some metaphysical questions, something like, "Do you believe in God?" or something, and Churchill's reply was, "What a continental question," which I thought was terribly amusing, and I think I will use this whenever I'm asked a question that I find hard to answer. So the concert last night was brilliant, I thought. Mindoyantz was magnificent in the cadenzas. They're mind-blowingly difficult, particularly in the first movement, where the development is really just this cadenza, which is overwhelmingly spectacular. And of course the pianist plays it entirely solo. The Lutosławski I hadn't heard many times. It was very exciting work and is very popular with the public. I can quite understand why. It doesn't have the sort of inaccessibility of the avant-garde, which often happens. It was just so exciting sonically. This wonderful use of timbres and different instruments and wonderful rhythms and wild brass, screaming brass sections. It was just the most spectacular work. So on to today. Today was a very interesting day. The day's not over, of course. I have to immediately talk about what I heard earlier. But the first pianist, it must be terribly difficult, to be the first in a competition like this, where the level is so dramatically high. It was an Italian, Leonardo Pierdomenico. And as usual with this part of the competition, because it's a free choice, we are introduced to works which have never been heard before by many of us. I had never heard Respighi's Nocturne. I didn't even know he wrote a nocturne. And it has nothing military about it at all, not like the Pines of Rome. And of course it was I wrote here that it was con amore, and I would say it was a sort of love poem, very refined, there was a left-hand sort of repetitive section which sort of cultivated the feeling of night. And on top of this you had a very delicate melody, very impressionistic. And Leonardo played it just like he was painting. I was very impressed with the sensitivity of this performance, even of something that I had never heard before. And he chose to play on the Fazioli, which seemed to suit his approach to the instrument. It has this very velvet touch, very beautiful sound. Of course, the piano is not only the sound; it's the action as well. And some pianists find Fazioli's a little heavy to play, but you would never know that listening to this beautiful performance. He then played a sonata by Clementi, the F-sharp minor sonata, Opus 25, number 2. And, Clementi is a very underrated composer. Some of his symphonies are spectacularly effective. And Italians, I think they have an affinity with Clementi. I know a number of Italians who play Clementi sonatas and who have recorded them. And in fact, Horowitz had a very high opinion of the G minor sonata, and Horowitz brought out a vinyl LP, I don't know if it's ever been transferred to CD, but probably, of Clementi sonatas. He played them with a minimal pedal, which is very much like Leonardo played, and a great deal of classical detachment. So if it's good enough for Horowitz, Clementi, it's certainly good enough for any pianist. I think he was a very sensitive performer, and the lento movement, the slow movement of the sonata, was very seductively melancholic, I thought. The list he played, which was something else I'd never heard before, a scherzo and march. The scherzo was truly amusingly, as a scherzo ought to be. I mean, Chopin's scherzos were hardly considered to be amusing jokes. I mean, scherzo means joke in Italian. But the list certainly had a sense of humour in much of this, and I think that Leonardo brought this out. So it was a surprisingly encouraging first performance, I thought. Usually first performances, you don't know what to make of it. We then had Sergei Paderewski from Russia, and he also decided to play the Fazioli. He started with the Rondo and Capriccio in G major. This is Opus 129, actually, of Beethoven. I thought, from the tempo point of view, I thought it was very brilliantly played. Wonderful articulation, minimal pedaling, and very classical in style. But I felt that the tempo meant that the expressiveness was slightly limited. If you adopt too broad a tempo, the inner details can be lost on the listener. And I think this is a very important point with young pianists, that they practice these works so much and they're so familiar with the internal workings of the work, they forget that the listener, like myself, has to unravel this, and you have to have a certain amount of time to follow what's going on, because you haven't been practicing it 16 hours a day for the last 3 years. So that was all I felt, that there was a certain element of the bucolic Beethoven which was a bit missing because of the virtuosity of the playing, if you can follow what I mean. Beethoven was rather a rough character, I mean, when you read about him, some terribly amusing things. I mean, when he was in cafes, for example, if he didn't like somebody who was sitting near him, he would stare at them in some sort of extremely aggressive way. And if they didn't move from the seat, he would stare at them and then spit on the floor like that. He must have been an extraordinary character, I must say. But you can sometimes hear this in his music. He then played a piece by Taneyev, which I didn't know this piece at all, a prelude and a fugue, which was harmonically and melodically rather a grand work, I must say. Very expressive, and the fugue was a very impressive piece with much internal detail, as I was saying. I just can't really comment on whether this was a fine performance or not, because I'm not familiar enough with this prelude and fugue. Harmonie du Soir of Liszt, such a wonderful romantic work, I think. It has this romantic sensibility of night. Of course, that's what the title tells you this. And I think that what a lot of young pianists overlook is the influence of literature on music in those days, the influence of poetry. Because, you know, if you take a composer like Schumann, he actually at times rated poetry higher than music. And so much of his music is inspired by literature. Now, where you have Liszt, the influence of Lord Byron on European culture when Byron was forced to leave England because of the scandal with his half-sister Augusta and so on, the influence he had was incalculable, actually. And you know, if you think of Berlioz and that wonderful piece, Childe Harold, Harold in Italy, inspired by Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, written by Byron, I think that a lot of young people should be directed towards the literary context behind a lot of these 19th century romantic works, because the literature is very high-flown in its language, very musical in its, because of course poetry is pure music together with meaning of words. And I think more direction in that area would benefit a lot of younger people playing romantic music. More reading. It's not cosmetic, you know. And not only that, it's very interesting. I mean, if you are practicing the piano all day, it's not that interesting an occupation. I mean, I've done it. I know what it's like. I mean, I think Godowsky used to read a newspaper while he was practicing on the music desk. He had a newspaper. But, or it might have been Hoffman. I might have got that wrong. Anyway, reading around the work, I think, is terribly important. E.T.A. Hoffman had such a huge influence on Schumann. And you can't really understand a work like Kreisleriana unless you understand the literary craziness that was behind this particular work. Right, so then we went on to a very good pianist from the Czech Republic, Marek Kozak. It's very easy, you know, when you're a listener at these competitions to become terribly blasé about the level at which these young people are playing. You know, and you say, oh, well, I didn't really like this. No, that was quite good. I wouldn't have even gone in the DVD stage of the competition. Or, you know, it's very easy to become too blasé about the achievements of every young pianist who manages to get into such a competition. And the standard of competition here, the standard of playing, is very, very high indeed. Very, very high. What we heard today was quite stunning in some ways. I liked very much the opening of Kozak's sonata. This was the 13th sonata, the one in E-flat major, Opus 27, because it has a subtitle, Quasi una Fantasia. And this gives it that sort of improvisatory feel, perhaps. What are you trying to say in a work? And I think that this is terribly important, you know, to a younger pianist, that he tries to focus on what message is he trying to get across in this work. I mean, what is he trying to say about us? What is he trying to tell us about it? Is he just playing the notes? Does he have no sort of, not ulterior motive, but a deeper meaning, if you understand what I'm getting at? I think this question has to be answered. What am I trying to say to the audience here about the music, not about my great skill and whether I'm going to move ahead to Hanover and my career and all of the rest of that. The Chopin scherzo was extremely well played, I thought. I felt that he missed slightly the deeper tragic element of these scherzos, you know. Chopin scherzos, they're no joke. And Schumann said something similar to that. If this is a joke, or something to that effect, I can't remember Schumann's exact words, but it was something like, if these are jokes, what is tragedy? Something like that. It must be absolutely a suicidal situation. And he finally ended up with another unfamiliar piece for me by Skumal, I think you pronounce it like that, the Jongleur. A jongleur, I presume, is a type of acrobat, juggler, and so on. This was rather a spectacular virtuosic piece, which was extremely attractive in an undemanding sort of way. Technically, very impressive work. Then we went on to Tianyuan Liu, or Liu Tianyuan. I'm not sure. I'm never sure of how to arrange these names. Who played a well-known piece of Bach, arranged by Petri. The sheep may safely graze. I mean, we all know this work very well. He then played a work which I managed to research during his playing of it on my miraculous iPhone by an American contemporary composer named Kirshner, who I wasn't very familiar with his music at all. He succeeded Walter Piston as professor of music at Harvard from 1966 to 1989, so he was clearly a serious compositional operative. Then we heard a very convincing, I thought, account of Mentner, Mentner's Sonata in G minor, Opus 22. Mentner is still a composer where you ask the question, do you like Mentner? And some people look slightly confused, and others say, oh yes, I love the concertos and so on. But he wrote this marvelous sonata, which has very heartfelt, rhapsodic elements within it, of love and yearning and so on. Great emotional range. Mentner has, his music, enormous emotional range and response. A very impressive performance by quite a young Chinese pianist. We go on then to something very dear to my heart, I must say, which was a Japanese young lady named Saya Ota. And she started off with something that is very, very dear to my heart, is these Grunfeld arrangements of Viennese waltzes. Grunfeld was a great virtuoso, and he wrote a number of this type of confections, you might call them Viennese confections. But I enjoyed this very much. It could have perhaps had a bit more of Viennese Gemütlich in it, but the joyful emotion of Grunfeld and Vienna, fin de siècle, Vienna was present there. And of course I love Vienna. That's probably one of the reasons. You don't have to be in the dark night of the soul in music all the time, do you? She then played an excellently prepared, I thought, Scriabin, the Piano Sonata No. 7. This was Opus 64. You know, Scriabin is so difficult to penetrate the metaphysical element of his writing, you know. He wasn't really of this world, Scriabin. He was of another world. And when you read Scriabin's own poetry, you realize he was, at certain times in his life, aspiring to fly to the stars. And I think that it makes great demands on the, not exactly the religious imagination of the pianist, but certainly the ability of a pianist to move beyond the physical, to inhabit the world of metaphysics. You can't really ask younger pianists to be doing such a thing, I don't think. You know, you have to have had serious reversals in your life, I think, to actually want to inhabit that sort of world, to try to understand it. And with with Scriabin, there has to be this communication of mystery, in his whole harmonic development within the work. That it's not quite there, and why isn't it? And you feel this element of unsolvable metaphysical mysteries. I felt that this was not avoided, but not quite grasped, and you can't really expect this movement of the soul from a young pianist. The list was very impressive. It was the paraphrase on Rigoletto, Verdi's opera, was marvellous, so enjoyable. Her technique is so superbly honed, never an incorrect note, never the slightest fluff of anything. And it made me want to sing, I got quite into that marvellous piece of music. It's a paraphrase. We play them as pieces, but of course they were very useful. I mean, Liszt was very useful. That's the important thing, because people couldn't hear music as often as we do. I mean, in recordings and all this stuff, we get very used to this idea of constantly being able to repeat. That was not the case. You may only have heard an opera once in your life, and Liszt reminded you of this if you had a piano, and most domestic establishments had pianos in those days. And you could play, of course. You'd have to be able to play such a work. So the list got me foot tapping and very eloquently phrased, and I just wanted to sing. I loved the rubato, marvellous. I've been following the career of this Polish pianist who next played his Kamil Pakolec. I heard him playing in the first Chopin competition on period instruments, and it impressed me greatly. He played a beautiful barcarolle, Chopin barcarolle to begin. He began without the great crash into the wharf, which is one of my bêtes noires that you just push off on the romantic journey across the lagoon. You don't have an accident at the beginning, so that this should not be sort of sforzando. It should be just gently setting the mood of the work. It was a very warm and expressive barcarolle that never went into the excessive, It never became the Titanic on the Atlantic in a storm, if you know what I mean. It had a wonderful narrative, I felt, his barcarolle. It had a narrative conception which I was very impressed with. He played Debussy from the preludes from the Verst book, and the three of them very beautiful, very impressionistic. Anna Capri, the interrupted serenade, and of course the submerged cathedral. I thought the submerged cathedral was superbly done. He really did paint this picture of this extraordinary idea. I mean, when you think about it, the Cathédrale Engloutie, I mean, a submerged, magnificent piece of architecture. How do you paint this in sound? And why would you? That is, it was beautifully done. I loved it. The list I thought was absolutely terrific. He played the Gounod waltz from Faust, arranged by Liszt, and it was just so natural. And I don't know if he's a jazz pianist or not, but he certainly has this perfect idea of waltz rhythm, and the phrasing was great, and the change of moods were wonderful, and the sort of romantic element was there, and I adored it. I thought it was a terrific performance. And then the last was a very fine pianist from China, Bolai. I think you pronounce it Cao or Cao. Cao. I'm not sure. It's CAO. So you can write to this space and tell me how I should have said it. From the very first moments of the Scarlatti Sonata, the sound he produced, he was playing a Yamaha, the sound was brilliant. There's something about many Chinese pianists, they produce this wonderful burnish, this glitter. It's not like the Russian tone, which is rich and deep and within the instrument. It's this fabulous sort of glowing, glittering sound. And the Scarlatti was super, played with no pedal at all to my feel. I didn't think so. Terrific forward drive. He really should play more Scarlatti sonatas. I think he has a great talent for them. And the tone was the thing that struck me. And this went through the entire performance. His marvelous tone and the fact that he never went beyond in forte and piano. He never broke anything of the ceiling, of the sound ceiling of the instrument ever. He played the Beethoven Les Adieux Sonata, which I'm particularly fond of. I felt that he played it extremely well, technically speaking, but I felt he could have put more real emotion into this. I mean, Beethoven was a man of emotional extremes, as we all know. This doesn't mean that you should verge into sentimentalism, but you have to be able to communicate it, that you're feeling what it feels like for a person very close to you to be leaving. And of course, leaving at the time Beethoven was living was quite different to us leaving in a motor car or an aeroplane. I mean, they left for quite some time in a carriage. And not only that, there was no police force. It was dangerous. And when someone was leaving by carriage, they may not come back. I mean, they may be buried in an avalanche in Switzerland. They may be attacked by bandits. I mean, anything could happen from that point of view. So I felt just it could have been a bit less cool, if you understand what I'm saying. Just a little bit less cool in the performance. Not quite emotionally deep enough. But his finger technique is mind-boggling. I mean, in the particularly the last piece he played, which was the Transcendental Study Number 10, Appassionato. Spectacular! It was just awesome, to use a modern word. Absolutely awesome. He also played before that L'Île Joyeuse of Debussy, and of course the story behind that particular piece is very interesting. There is a story, of course, that Debussy went to the island of Jersey with his lover, Emma Bardak, and somehow packed his wife off. But actually, the fact of it is that he, in fact, wrote this work before he went to Jersey. But I don't think it necessarily removes the impact of the story. But one thing that he could well have seen is there was a painting by Watteau called the L'Embarcation pour Cythère, or the embarkation for the island of Cythera, which was the island of love. You could look at this actually as not the embarkation to the island of love, but perhaps coming home from it. But I think that the connection with Watteau is a very interesting one because of, Watteau's paintings they have this wonderful sense of time transience and melancholy about them, that emotions and feelings will fade. And I think that this sense of transience, is very strong in his paintings. And I think that this probably attracted Debussy to these paintings. He certainly knew of them. So we either have the story, which is very acceptable in my mind, or the paintings. Well, I haven't got much more to tell you about the works that we've listened to this morning. So I will probably be joining, I will be joining you tomorrow. And so it's a good night from him.